Thank you all for being here. Good evening to everyone. I'm Betty Duke. I'm the Florence and Norman Brody Forum Professor here at the school. And along with the Brody family and the Brody Scholar, Kaylee Love, and with the student board of the foundation group, I'm delighted to welcome all of you. There's still some seats over on this side if you can't find one over there. I'm delighted to welcome you because this is a very special event. So I'm going to keep my remarks very short so we can get on with the evening. I want to put this event into the framework of the Brody program. Because the donors who set the Brody Forum up had a vision, and I want to share that with you. Florence was actually an alum of the university, and her husband used to say that he was an alum by marriage. And they shared this commitment that the power of education was to change the world through ideas and leadership. And that's what we try to do with the Brody Forum. They believed in education, and they believed in this school, in this university. And so we've had these forums for a number of years. We bring important people here to talk about important topics. Norman and Florence are no longer with us, but their legacy is carried on by their children. Sherry Brodner is their daughter, and she and her partner live in Boston, and they're not able to be here this evening. Also carrying on that tradition are Bill and his wife and their daughter, Deirdre Lipsicus. Unfortunately, they can't be here. So normally they are here, but they're not here tonight, but they do send their regards and their best wishes and their thanks for our speaker this evening. Over the years, we've had some incredible speakers and from all areas of thought, great thought leaders. So I'm not going to take a lot of time to tell you the glories of the past. I'm going to move us into this evening. And to do that, I'm going to have the privilege of introducing one of my favorite colleagues. I'm going to introduce, I think, a man who needs no introduction for many in the room, Alec Rorsnop. Alec is assistant professor here, and he is also the research fellow for our Center for International and Security Studies. His field of study is sub-state conflict, in which he focuses on the internal dynamics of non-state armed actors. He describes his own work as the intersection of international relations and comparative government. He specifically focuses on civil war, military effectiveness, civil-military relations, and institutional development in conflict and post-conflict environments. Alec is widely published. He is also one of the most beloved of our faculty and a very highly evaluated member of our faculty. He's a summa cum laude bachelor's from Colby and a PhD from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's a great colleague and a good friend, and it is my honor to introduce my colleague, Alec Rorsnop. I just dropped it.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you to everybody for being here and kind of making this talk happen. So I have the distinct honor of introducing Roger Petersen. He holds a BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Chicago. He's the Arthur Sloan Professor of Political Science, Arthur Sloan Professor of Political Science at MIT. He has 4 wonderful books, which is the last one. He's a kind of distinguished scholar in civil war and sub-state conflict. But there are actually 2 things I want to flag about Roger right before this talk starts to kind of put this in context, right? The first is that he's a social scientist that talks about what matters. So he's very well known for looking at the role of emotions in conflict. This is one of those things that seems obvious, right? Emotions probably matter in conflict. A lot of social science doesn't think about it that way. A lot of policy doesn't think about it that way. So this is a really important perspective to see where he's coming from. And the second thing about Roger is that he's incredibly clear at presenting complex thoughts and complicated thoughts and this sort of thing. I have a book of his, one of the 4, Resistance and Rebellion, that I've lent to so many graduate students because it's such a clear demonstration of how to talk about difficult mechanisms and challenges in conflict environments, right? So this is somebody that can communicate complex thoughts and not use jargon, just tell us what's actually going on. right? And so in this context, beyond being clear and direct, though, right, it's quite methodologically rigorous. We believe his answer when he gets there. And so I think this, for those that are in my military intervention class or have been in that, right, the U.S. experience in Iraq and Afghanistan are going to be quite meaningful for a whole generation of policymakers. We need the tools, the lenses to be clear about what went wrong, but not also have simple solutions, right, that are slogans. We need to actually know what happened. And I really can't think of somebody better than Roger to pick through the minutia of this conflict while seeing the big picture as well, too. So it's my honor to present Roger Petersen, and we look forward to the talk as well, too. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Well, thanks for having me here, and it's good to see some old friends in the audience. This book project started many years ago, actually, probably 2010. I organized conferences that mix practitioners and academics together to try to understand what was going on in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And I worked on this project on and off ever since 2010, probably. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on in Iraq. I thought it was one war when it started. And then I thought it was 4 wars. I thought there was a war in the south. I thought there was a war in Baghdad. I thought there was a war in Anbar. I thought there was a war in the north. But the more I interviewed soldiers, the more I interviewed Iraqis, the more I actually interviewed some insurgents, I realized it wasn't just 4 wars. This war was highly decentralized, and company commanders that were in charge of neighborhoods actually instituted strategies very differently. And so there were dozens of different wars going on in Iraq. And this is why Iraq is such a good laboratory actually for studying insurgency, counterinsurgency, state building, is because you have dozens of little different cases. But overarching this decentralized war was a struggle of master cleavages between the Shia, Sunni, and Kurds. So this is a war both decentralized and a war with the master cleavages going on. So I have 2 purposes in this book. One is to just give a richer description of what went on. And you'll see a lot of narratives incorporated by Iraqis, U.S. soldiers, State Department people. But as a political scientist, I'm interested in explaining variation in important outcomes. And the 2 outcomes that I try to explain in this book are violence and state building. And so just to talk about violence, just to review, this graph is SIG-acts from 2004 to 2008. SIG-acts are significant acts of violence recorded by the U.S. military. These are actions of violence against the U.S. military. And what you'll notice, this is Baghdad. Baghdad is going to go from 500 to 3,500 in a very quick fashion. This is where the bombing of Samarra is going to happen in 2006. This is where Zakari bombs the mosque in Samarra, and this is going to ignite a civil war between Shia and Sunnis. But you'll notice it's going to collapse very quickly again. This is the surge. These are the American troops. These are the coalition troops. You can see this is an American war, basically. And the surge is connected, seemingly, with the decline. But there's a lot of other explanations about it that's hard to tease out. You can look at Anbar. You can see the Anbar, the violence is declining before the surge. So this sheds light that the surge was the causal. You'll see other types of regions where there wasn't a whole lot of violence. This is the Iraq body count. So these are the civilian deaths that are recorded and documented. This is what the 2004 to 2008 with the slide before. Civilian deaths sort of mirror what happened with actions against the U.S. military, but you'll see U.S. is going to withdraw in 2011. This is going to be the ISIS war, and you're going to see massive amounts of civilian death again. So one of the questions is, after all of the blood and treasure spent by the United States here, how did this happen again? So this is the questions with variation in violence. State building, Iraq is a very weak state today. In many ways, it's actually a democracy. They have competitive elections, they have changes of government that are peaceful, but it's, by most measures we do in comparative politics, this is a very weak state. Why, when we went there to build a strong state, do we have the perpetuation of this weak state? So these are the two questions I have. So what I want to do is bring my analytical framework. Alec mentioned the Resistance and Rebellion book. It's actually the same analytical framework in a way. It's modified that I had in the Resistance and Rebellion book. And partly that's because soldiers in Iraq were actually using parts of this book. So I thought, well, if it's good enough for them, let me give it a try myself. The book is also translated into Chinese. The Chinese are no doubt using it to help repress Uyghurs. We can't always help what we do in academia. But this analytical framework has three parts: roles, mechanisms, and strategies. So one are roles. And if you read Resistance and Rebellion, by the way, there's the positive roles here are the support of the Iraqi government and the counterinsurgents. The negative roles are the insurgent roles. In the Resistance and Rebellion book, it was the Soviets were the negative side and the insurgents were the positive side, but I had a hard time giving Al-Qaeda positive valence, so I've switched it here. So a little bit different than the Resistance and Rebellion book, but a lot of people just want to stay out of both sides, and they want to stay neutral. So there's a lot of neutrals. Going this side, these are unarmed, unorganized people, but they will give information to the insurgents and other types of support. -2 is armed and local. So these are local people that sometimes will have normal jobs in the day, but they're acting with militias at night. -3 are mobile combatants. This would be Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other groups like that on the insurgent side. Going this way, +1, these are people who vote in the elections. These are people who give information to the counterinsurgents to the state. +2, this is local and armed again, but state. Some of these are state militias. This is also the local police. Again, a local armed force. +3 are the government forces. So the big question, though, the big issue is that people move back and forth out of these roles. Sometimes they're moving from neutrality, one side or the other. Sometimes they're flipping from an armed group here and flipping over to the this side. So the question becomes, what are the forces that move them from one role or another? And in social science, we often call these small, sort of identifiable forces mechanisms. And so there's 4 kinds of mechanisms that we generally study in social science. One is just rational choice. And a lot of this is economically based incentives. Hey, you move over to this side, we'll give you a job, and you're going to pull over to the state side instead of the insurgency side. So one is just straightforward sort of rational calculation. The second one is emotions, which Alex mentioned. And emotions can shape your preferences, they can shape your information collection, they can shape your belief formation. If you're fearful, you may stay at 0. Hey, I'm afraid to move one way or the other. If there's a lot of violence going, I'm just going to keep my head down. If I'm angry, I may, because some group planted a bomb in my neighborhood, I may move into the local armed support. So there are these emotions. The third kind of mechanism is normative. You don't calculate, it's not because of emotions, you do it because it's the standard way of doing things. This is going to be important in mobilization in Iraq, especially in the tribal areas. If you're a member of a tribe, you may not calculate, you may not be able, you're going to move with your tribe one way or another, with your group one way or another. The fourth are psychological mechanisms. They differ from emotions in different ways, but cognitive dissonance, prejudice, these aren't going to play a big role in the book, by the way, but these are the 4 sort of categories. One of the findings of the book I'm going to have is that rational choice mechanisms are overvalued by the counterinsurgents, and the emotions connected to group identity are far more powerful. And this is one of the things the United States did not understand when they went into this game. So everybody has an idea about mechanisms. This is a quote, let you read this. This is Colonel Sassaman's quote. This is an encapsulation of a theory of mechanisms which to use. Colonel Sassaman, fear, if you move over to the negative side, you're going to maybe be subject to violence. But if you come to our side, we'll give you, we got projects, we got money for you. So everybody has sort of an idea about which mechanisms are the mechanisms to use. So there's roles, and then the mechanisms which move people up and down those roles. And then there are the insurgents and counterinsurgents who have strategies. They have theories about how to trigger mechanisms to move people into the desired positions. So these are 4 counterinsurgency strategies that the United States did in different places and times and different combinations. Clear hold build. This is what General Petraeus was doing. This is what Field Manual 3 TAC 24 was doing. It's a sequential idea. If you read Clausewitz in here, I just came from Annapolis. Everyone has to read Clausewitz there. But wars have a center of gravity. Petraeus' idea, the center of gravity is the general population. If we protect the population and show them that they will advance sort of economically, we can move people, even if they're the unarmed people with the insurgents or the neutrals, we'll move them to +1. If they're here, they give information to the forces here, the government security forces that the U.S. is building up, and then you go after the mobile insurgents. That's the basic logic of clear hold build. The other thing is you do not deal with local armed militias. This is not a way to build a state according to the Petraeus idea. So that's one. Let me move down to, this is tribal mobilization because I did this slide back in the day when I was looking at Anbar, but it should be community mobilizations more broadly. There's different communities, and again, sometimes these are held together by norms. But this is the idea of don't worry about the population so much. Try to get these actors, the armed local actors, and flip them over to the positive side. And this is what we're going to do. This is a Marine slide from Ramadi in Anbar province. Every neighborhood in Ramadi was controlled by a different tribe. So what the Marines did is they code the different tribes, 12 uncooperative, 6 cooperative here in June of 2006. And this is the idea with the awakening. We're going to move them over from uncooperative to cooperative, from -2 in my scale to +2, and we're going to bring them right over. And this is what January 2000, or only 6 months later, basically, or 8 months later, they've made deals to bring majority of tribes over to cooperative. This is the idea of community mobilization. I'm going to talk about its advantages and disadvantages later, but this is certainly one in Iraq. Going back, let me go back. Decapitation. Decapitation says it's too messy to deal with the population at all. Dealing with these guys, these guys are unsavory characters lots of times, the local armed leaders. Let's just worry about decapitating the opposing force. And we'll build it up by special forces here. And this is really what's going on in Iraq with the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC. So the military loves acronyms. It's a whole language. This is F3EA. Find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze. This is what JSOC is doing. You have a target. You look at the pattern of life. You follow the target. You finish the target. You gain information, collect their flash drives and their laptop computers, you analyze it, and then you use it to find a new target. In 2004 or so, this cycle is running 3-4 times a month maybe. By 2008, JSOC is running this cycle twice a night sometimes. They're getting very good at F3EA here. But this is the decapitation strategy, which is basically a counterterrorism strategy rather than a counterinsurgency strategy for most of it. So the fourth strategy, homogenization. This is let the sides fight themselves out. They'll get on one side or the other, and then we can come in and establish a boundary and do peacekeeping. So basically, local people, they'll fight and they'll cut in homogeneous zones, and this is actually going to create peace. Now, this is going to happen. This is Baghdad before, at the time of the invasion, 2003. The yellow are mixed Sunni and Shia neighborhoods. Green is Shia. This is what was Saddam City. It's going to become Sadr City. There's 1.5 million impoverished Shia living here. These are red are the Sunni neighborhoods. What's going to happen by 2007? There's almost nothing left that's mixed. What's going to happen is the Jaish al-Mahdi, connected with the Sadrist movement, is going to come and ethnically cleanse most of these neighborhoods, moving southwest. The Sunnis are going to gather here and create defensible lines. And what the United States is going to do is they're going to come in and put T-walls here. This is happening at the same time. So that precipitous decline, a lot of people say, hey, Petraeus, it wasn't your surge. It was actually just the populations got separated at this time. Some people are saying it was JSOC got better, which it was. And some people are saying we had the awakening at the same. All these things are sort of happening. So it's hard to separate the sort of causal effects. So what I do in the second section of the book is I apply this analytical framework to, well, first off, I'll summarize. These are the structural variables we're often studying in political science. This was really how Civil War was studied. There's at least 1,000 studies of statistical studies that try to explain why civil wars occur and why they're sustained. I think my competing explanation is it's the combination of strategies that really explain things more than it does these more static variables. The U.S., the counterinsurgent has a strategy. The insurgents have a strategy. When you look at them in combined, they set off different mechanisms. Those mechanisms set off people on one side of the spectrum of roles. If you understand this, you'll understand variation in violence and why the state is weak. And in the book, the second section is going to apply this method to explain 2003 to 2011. In the third section of the book, this becomes, from the dependent variable, becomes an independent variable, and the legacy of the time. The U.S. is going to withdraw in 2011. What is the legacy on what we see from 2011 to 2021 in Iraq? So I apply this to a bunch of cases. I mean, this is a simple case. This is going to be Sadr City. That's that big green area of Shia. U.S. is going to come in 2004 to 2006. This chapter is based a lot on an S2, that would be an intelligence officer of the Army, and how the U.S. was actually operating in Sadr City. The Sadrists and the Jaish al-Mahdi got into a military confrontation with the United States in 2004 in Najaf and other places. U.S. really decimated them. A lot of the people in the U.S. thought they're done. But what's going to happen is the Jaish al-Mahdi is going to become the force that is going to ethnically cleanse Baghdad and change the whole face of the war, and change the whole face of by 2006. So what's going on here? And again, in 2008, the U.S. is going to decimate Sadr. And today, in 2024, the Sadrists are still the most powerful force in Iraq. What explains the resiliency of this? So that's part of the reason I'm doing the case on the Sadrists, is explaining the resiliency of this group. What were they doing in this period before their decimation in 2004 until their power of being able to ethnically cleanse Baghdad? And by the way, Alec Worsnop has done the fundamental work on the Jaish al-Mahdi and how they did this, so I'm borrowing a lot on his work. U.S. strategy, their strategy was mostly to concentrate on hearts and minds, to move people from neutrality or sympathy with the insurgents to this +1 position where they're going to get information. The police stations, all the police just left after the invasion. U.S. wants to build up the police stations. That's all they're really doing. They're not going to come in and challenge the Jaish al-Mahdi in Sadr City because it's very hard to do and wasn't seen as politically important. But then you look at what the Jaish al-Mahdi and the Sadrists were doing. They were rebuilding their militias, some with help from Iran, both at the local level and the more mobile level. They create and develop the Office of the Martyr Sadr, who's going to give economic goods and housing and other values to get sympathy with the population. They're going to infiltrate the police stations, and they're also going to hit the U.S. with mortars. And they calibrate their violence. They don't kill high officers, but they're going to keep the U.S. pinned down, so they don't want to come in here. And so you can look at other cases. Well, this is just to give you why the United States is not coming in here very much. Another person I created the case study from was a special forces officer who was going into raids into Sadr City. Why aren't we doing raids? This is a quote from my interview here. You can read it. I think sometimes these quotes give you some idea about the difficulties of counterinsurgency here. So taking on the Sadrists, not an easy thing, and they're going to go and ethnically cleanse lots of, and I can talk more about that, but this is another case. This is the case of the Bayan neighborhood in 2008. This is again the U.S. strategy, concentrating on support here, but also concentrating on raids against the mobile combatants. The insurgent strategy, they're integrating their militias in with the locals. They are using the Office of the Martyr Sadr in with organized resistance to build that. They are infiltrating the police stations, and they have sniper attacks. Why are we're going to have democracy? Well, the Sunnis boycotted the election of 2005. Shia groups dominated. The Badr group, which is part of the coalition, says we only want one ministry above all. We want the Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of the Interior had created these wolf brigades, which weren't responsible to anybody but within their organization. Badr wants that because they can take it and they can use it for revenge against everybody they want. And what they're going to do is create torture cells and everything else. These groups had a plan. They came in, they captured sections of the state, and they used it for their own purposes. And they're still there today. And the PMF, the Tayyip Hezbollah, are the brains and the leadership, and Badr organization is the body of the PMF, of the Popular Mobilization Forces, that are a security force, highly legitimate, more legitimate maybe than the Iraqi army, state army. I was in Baghdad a couple years ago, or a year and a half ago. What happened after the Shia basically have won, there was a division, which happens lots of times among the winners. The Sadr group, which is very strong, everybody else, all the other Shia groups balanced against Sadr into something called the coordination framework. This is me, obviously, with the white hair, the old guy, and these are members of the coordination framework, Shia group that's aligned against Sadr. So I'm talking with these leaders. This guy is Mohammed Shia al-Sudani. He is the current prime minister of Iraq. When I gave this talk, not long before the elections, he was just another dude in the room. He was not told me that he was a powerful guy. It's because this system, they don't want a powerful guy. They like to have this fragmented system where they all get some of the goods and all maintain their militias and all get money to maintain their militias from the government, and they pick guys that are just competent guys but who aren't going to upset this system. And that's really the way this system works. So the four section of the book. The fourth section of the book is the future of U.S. military interventions. What are we learning about where we're going to go from this? So let me go back to so this is section 3, by the way, looking at Hawija. I'm looking at the ISIS war, which the U.S. forces actually, I think, did incredibly good job in the ISIS war. U.S. forces learned a lot of things, by the way. This is not all a disaster. Hybrid actions, this is how the popular mobilization forces were formed. This is about the Christians and how even the Christians form militias. The Kurds, who can't get their act together, I could talk about that a long time. And then actually the decline of resentment, because once one group wins, they don't need to be fighting anymore. You can be generous, and that's actually what's sort of happening. The future, any rate, that's very short, very speculative, hard to know the future, but come back to this. Clear hole build. Are we going to be doing this in the near future? No, we are not. This is very expensive in terms of both manpower and money. Counterinsurgency, I was just at the Naval Academy yesterday. Counterinsurgency is sort of a dirty word. We want to move on to peer competition now. And that's what the military likes to do. Air Force guys like to fly planes, and naval people want to do their boats and submarines. They don't want to be training people. They don't want to be doing this kind of thing. It's not their mission. They have a bias for the offense, not the defense. This is very something they want to do. Are we going to get into this again? I don't think we don't want to. But in 2000, when Bush came president, they're saying we're not going to do this nation building stuff at all. And then 9/11 happened, and have 20 years of counterinsurgency. But a broader problem for Western state building projects, illustrated by the Iraq case, is that for much of the world, states are no longer states in the Weberian sense. States increasingly lack the legitimate control of the legitimate means of violence and the means to project centralized power. Western interveners may not wish to launch state building strategies in an environment that they cannot predict, shape, or fully understand. Decapitation, we are going to be doing decapitation. And part of it is the United States is just really good at it now. We can hit targets, and you like to do what you're good at. I think actually the U.S. could develop relationships with special force communities and allied states around the world, and they could have a lawn mowing, is what they call it, with the Israelis on a global scale. The Iraq War showed that the U.S., especially against ISIS, showed that the U.S. has a machine to do this. But the preference for decapitation, which is low cost, especially with drones, you won't even have pilots getting shot now. And it has lots of problems. There's severe limits on what bombing alone can do, not to mention the legal and moral issues with this strategy. Community mobilization. Flipping communities from the opponent's sphere into one's own sphere provides critical information. It takes an armed actor away from the opponent and puts it into your fold, and it increases manpower for the state's forces. In Iraq, the Awakening and the Sons of Iraq movements played a significant role in the drop in violence. But community mobilization is only an effective strategy probably in the short run. Because these leaders, you're not taking away any of their autonomy. The deals made between a counterinsurgent and community leaders are not likely to reduce the latter's local base, agency, or autonomy. These groups can work both sides, and they'll change back and forth, always looking for a better deal. A lot of the groups we flipped in the Awakening are going to ally with ISIS coming in 2014. So I think the U.S. is likely to continue practicing forms of this community mobilization, and this is related to proxy war in some ways, but the nature of this game is going to be opportunistic and ad hoc. Homogenization. If master cleavages and concerns about group hierarchy are salient in a violent conflict, the conflict is unlikely to end until there is clarity in that hierarchy. And homogenization can produce the clarity in that hierarchy because there's only your group on the one side. given the overall reticence to engage in large-scale military intervention after Iraq and Afghanistan, I think the U.S. seems likely to allow more and more future conflicts to burn on, to allow homogenization to take place. In my experience, many in the Arab world believe allowing homogenization to unfold was the U.S. policy in Syria, in fact. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars have sapped American confidence in intervention. Best to look away. Accepting homogenization may become an unstated policy for many of the world's most violent ethnic conflicts. If this analysis is correct, it paints a bleak future for the right to protect movement. The summary point, the U.S. has bases all around the world. This is the comparative advantage of the United States versus China and Russia and our allies. What I think is very possible is we're going to develop special relationships from our bases, especially with special forces around the world, and we're going to institute decapitation and community mobilization. And this is a lower cost. Whether this is really a good policy for the United States, I don't know, but I'm afraid this is where, after the costs and perception of Iraq, where we might actually go. So let me conclude with three final comments. One is on the relative power of different mechanisms. Mechanisms connected to group identity and group hierarchy are more persistent and usually more powerful than economic incentives. This is doling out money in Hawija. We did a lot of this. Commander emergency, the CERT money it's called. You're just going around handing out money. I think this gives you some short-term gains, but when push comes to shove, people aren't going to ignore their identity. They're going to go basically to this -1 very quickly, this idea about I'm going to support people that are going to support my group position, and I think this is really what's happening. This is a picture. This is Najmuddin Karim. He was the mayor of Kirkuk's office, who I dealt with over there. After the Kurds had an independence referendum, the PUK and KDP, the two major Kurdish parties, sort of split. The Arabs came back, they retook the disputed territories, and they're sitting, these are Arab from the central government, they're taking selfies and gloating in the Kurdish mayor of Kirkuk's office. This is really the underlying kind of thing which is driving this kind of conflict, and you don't get rid of it very fast. This is, if you read my other work on Yugoslavia, I think this has happened. I'm married to a Serb. Serbs and Bosniaks, or Muslims in Bosnia, they didn't have any problem with each other until the political system was going to make the Muslims above Serbs. This is very hard for them to take. And this happens, I think, in our own country. If you look at Donald Trump, we have identity politics here. I'm from rural Nebraska. I'm actually the vice president of a small agricultural corporation there. I get back. They're all voting for Trump. Biden, he wanted to build infrastructure projects and try to get people that were voting for Trump, see what good the Democratic Party can do for you. Well, 97% of the people, according to recent polls, that voted for Trump in 2020 are going to vote for him again in 2024. They don't care about these economic projects because they see that their perception is that their country is being taken away from them, and Trump gets into that. If we don't understand our own identity problems, I'm not sure how we understand identity problems around the world. But I think this is my idea about human nature, that we identify with groups and we act and we'll even support violence in terms of our group identities. The second point, I think Shia dominance and Iranian influence were inevitable in Iraq, especially when we had democracy. The Shia were 60%. They perceived themselves as below the Sunnis in status hierarchy. By most measures, they were accurate on that. I think I was reading this book on Vietnam. Alec, you're familiar with this, The Irony of Vietnam, The System Worked, by Betts and Gelb. They said, in Vietnam, anyone that knew about Indochina could predict that inevitably the Vietnamese would expel the French and the U.S., two Vietnamese factions would fight it out, and the communists would very likely win. I think these are similar predictions. I think that the Shia were not going to be denied becoming dominant, especially when they could win elections, when they were so organized and could take over factions of the state. I think the U.S. policy could have a lot to do with violence. I think it had a lot to do with the contours of state building, but on some of these basic issues, military power just cannot really change the flow of it. I think, we could have done better with systems, and the U.S. Army got too close with some of the groups like Badr and the Peshmerga, and we could have forced some different issues. But on this bigger master cleavage thing, I think this was going to happen. The last point I want to talk about is the ways I collected information and data for the book. I'd like to highlight that this involved a lot of collaboration with graduate students and one former colleague. Alec did a lot of the work on militia organizations and did some of the background work on the theories that I looked at there, and of course his critical insights on the Jaish al-Mahdi militia and militias in general were important. But I also I knew my limits, so I was smart enough to recruit students. One I recruited was an Iraqi student. This is student Marcin al-Shamari. She now teaches at Boston College. But she's an Iraqi, and most of the things I know about the Shia come from my association with her. And she also helped me get into talking with the most important leaders in Iraq. This is Hakim. This is one of the members. He was head of the Skiri, the Supreme, the Badrist political arm. This is another student. One of the chapters is written with Timothy Wright. He's now a full colonel. He was a captain in the Bayah neighborhood of Baghdad during the surge, very bloody neighborhood. He applied to MIT. I was smart enough to bring him in and write a dissertation based on his field work. He was on the cover of Newsweek as the face of the Petraeus generation. And in the book, all his men called him Captain America. And I was looking at some of our lazy graduate students, Alec, not you, but other ones, and I said, we need to get Captain America into our graduate students, and I got him in, and I think it's chapter 10 in the book, I think this is the single best analytically guided case study of the surge that exists, and I'm very proud that I worked with Tim Wright. John Lindsay, who's now some of you might know him, he's a cybersecurity expert at Nunn School at Georgia Tech. And he and I wrote a case study for the Center for Irregular Warfare and Armed Groups at the Naval War College. This was early on. John actually was a Naval Reserve. He got called up in the reserves from Naval. He was in Anbar as a Naval intelligence officer. I don't know how the Navy gets out in the desert, but everybody wanted a piece of this game. And John has a lot to do with especially the delineation of the strategies. And then I also got Matt Kansian. He was doing work in Nineveh province. He co-authored the Christian chapter. So 3 of the 23 chapters are co-authored with practitioners, and I really benefited from their insights. I also relied on U.S. military personnel, not only in interviews, but as a source to make contacts with insurgents. Actually, during the awakening, when we were flipping insurgents over to our side, a lot of U.S. military guys, and they became good friends with insurgents that were killing them before. But now they're on our side. And I went through the awakening contacts, and one of the chapter on Ghazalios, 3 days of smoking hookah with the insurgent leaders, how I learned how to do things. So. I mean, there's high-tech political science, but I'm pretty low-tech. I'm learning how to do the anthropology here.
That needs to go in the book, Jack.
Yeah. But also the government and State Department connections, and one of the big issues is the relationship between the State Department and the military and how that was in Iraq. These are State Department contacts. The first Prime Minister, Ayad Alawi. This is Naqib. He was the Minister of the Interior who set up the Wolf Brigades, which were going to be taken over by Badr. This is one of the chapters in the book about the state capture of the Ministry of Interior. That's Rad al-Hamdani. He was one of Saddam Hussein's closest generals. why are these guys all together in a compound next to the U.S. Embassy in Amman, Jordan? Well, that's another story, but there's a lot of odd things that have happened in Iraq. And I think I'll stop here and take questions.
Thank you very much. I'll take the kind of proclivity as a chair to ask the first question and to zoom out a little bit, right? You spent 10 years doing this, talking to a lot of smart people that understood what was going on, I think, in a lot of different ways, in a small way. And then your conclusion is that you think the U.S. is going to pursue these kind of decapitation strategies moving forward. What do we know about what we've learned from the last 20 years, right? How is that manifesting in terms of people that make policy in the future, right? In simple terms, right? A lot of people knew what was going on, and yet we continue to repeat a lot of similar mistakes, right? And don't seem to have learned these big lessons that you're coming away from the book.
Well, one of the last chapters in the last section is about our constraints in learning, right here in Washington, D.C., right? And one thing I think the military, I think I mentioned this before, has incentives not to learn because they do have biases toward the offensive. Most military people do not want to be training other people. I mean, it's not what they got in the military to do. And so the military has a constraint to do that. The political system, and Joe Biden just wants to end these forever wars. And that is, I think, part of it's the thing about decapitation is just, it's alluring because of its low cost. We don't get dead Americans. And dead Americans are the red line in all of this. If you look at what just happened, the outpost in Jordan, where the Kataib Hezbollah group from Iraq actually hit the drone, but they've been hitting all these groups. We didn't really do anything until they were dead Americans, and then we had to make a strike, and we struck the leadership in Baghdad, in downtown Baghdad. But we don't want to deal with these dead Americans from a political side, and I think from the military side, from the political side, and I think we don't really want to do that, and I think we want to do what we're good at, and this is good. Another problem, though, in the U.S. military is just how good JSOC got, the Joint Special Operations Command. I don't know if we've got military people in here? Yeah, so, but Special Operations Forces, there's Green Berets, and then there's the JSOC guys. And we got too carried away with this, the JSOC side of things. What I think we really need to do is get back on the Green Berets, who are about training partner militaries and partner forces. But the funding and how cool it looked, it affected how we're actually dealing with our special forces. I don't know, do you agree with that?
Her husband, whoever it is, making connections to JSOC.
Yeah, so, but again, it's, you do what you're good at. If you're good at something, if you got a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? And then that's part of it. But I think just also after 20 years of wars, which are seen as not successful, pretty hard to want to expend American lives on this.
So just on that line really quickly, right, that just talking about neighborhoods in Baghdad, I think you did a good job of explaining how complicated that is. Do you think that if you were in that position at the time, you had a better strategy for dealing with it? In other words, is understanding that actually help us to deal with it in the short term?
Well, there were several successful cases. Here's one. This is in Hawija. And Hawija reduced violence. This is a completely Sunni town. It's actually in the Kirkuk governorate, so it's a problematically politically because it's a Sunni town in in what Kurds consider their area. But the U.S. forces had a combination of clear, hold, and build, and also community mobilization where they were moving people. And you see this idea about covering all of the nodes of the spectrum as well as you can. Basically, this is sort of a form of denial if you can do this. So they're working with the population here, and they were flipping some of the insurgents here, and violence reduced to basically zero. So this is a pretty good combination. In the Battle of Sadr City of 2008 and in the ISIS war, the U.S. combined basic war fighting with partnerships with special operations forces, the CTS, the Counterterrorism Service of Iraq, and some of the Peshmerga units. And they were the ones who were on the front lines and could guide our precision weapons strikes. And I think that was actually a success. No Americans were killed. ISIS was destroyed eventually. And we got around the problems of an incompetent Iraqi military that way. There are certain lessons that I think are going to go forward this way. Certain of these things are going to happen. Now, what's going to happen in Hawija, though, this goes back to my other point, which is the Hawija case. After we left, the Shia government under Maliki started repressing Sunnis again, and the whole population here moved to -1, against the government and for any type of Sunni organization. And when ISIS came in, most of these people are going to collaborate with ISIS. And again, that's the power of the identity here. And even though the U.S. was very smart about reducing the violence, this place was very peaceful when we left, because the political situation was not resolved, because the identity clarity and the hierarchy had not been solved, everything reverted back, and this became the last town because it was seen as a Sunni stronghold.
Yeah, questions? So everybody can hear you.
So you were talking about how the governance in Iraq has basically evolved. You use two words that we generally think of as bad, right? Weak and messy. Your chart of all the circles in different ways. But when you were talking, I was listening to it and thinking well, that sounds an awful lot like the United States, deliberately setting up this diffuse power system to make sure that nobody got too much power. And your messy graph reminds me of the whole idea of cross-cutting cleavages as a way of basically having stable governance in multi-ethnic societies. So I'm wondering if you think that the Iraqis have kind of come around on their own to something that's a pretty good system for them. Or is it fine for the people who have power and who basically are all getting some, but everybody who's sort of the average public deals with bad governance and lots of problems, and it's not functional for them?
Yeah, that last part is absolutely right. This is not functional for most. You only get a job because you're politically connected. Qualified, you don't get a job based on your qualifications. And as I was talking with the dean beforehand, you want to make a reform in the oil ministry. Well, that oil ministry has one of these groups that's controlling it. What they do, it's not so cross-cutting. It's that one group says, we'll take the Badr, they want the Ministry of Interior because they want the security. Some other groups or group will have the oil ministry. So if you want to make a reform in the oil ministry, it's not based on rational grounds, it's what you can do for that political group. Not only, and then they're going to hold the whole system hostage, and then you got to deal with them. So this is not very functional. The other thing, which is a little different, is that the security institutions in the United States, these are all state. I mean, we have some crazy militia guys in Michigan or whatever, but they're not like this, right? They're not serious about launching violence. And the thing is, because security concerns still dominate, economic growth concerns, nobody wants to give up their guns. So this system is like, we have 15 parties in the United States. We have a two-party system because of our institutions. But if we had 15 parties, if we had a party of the Christians in the South, and we had a party of New England people and this kind of thing, and then they all had guns, and they're all just dividing up different parts of the government. And then it's not like, I don't want to run the government efficiently. They don't have any incentive for that. They just want to take over what is going to be best for them and then make deals with the others. And the Iraqis, and another sign that the identity problems are being solved, the Tishreen they had in 2019, they had big demonstrations of the people saying, we have to get rid of this system, in fact, and we need a government which answers our demands. We need a government their phrase was actually, we want an Iraqi government. And right now it's a government of factions and not really an Iraqi government. So there are elements of balance that we try to do in our Constitution here between the states and the federal government, which we have, stuff about. There are elements like that do create this stability. But on the other hand, when you have everything that's just simply by patronage, that you don't have, we have two parties, they have a program about how to run these ministries. There's nothing that coherent really in Iraq for that.
Okay. Hi, thank you for coming in today. My question is, in your book, did you talk about cases where U.S. Army soldiers inflicted torture to Iraqi civilians? How did the crimes committed by Americans impact military culture and the public view on the military? And did those cases bring adjustments to military strategy?
Yeah, I don't deal a lot with that in the book, but it's important. And Abu Ghraib clearly was a watershed moment here. And it did affect how soldiers operated. And I think there were, especially because it's so decentralized, there wasn't often good supervision. A lot of people made deals on their own, for instance, and a lot of bad things probably happened. And I think the way the special forces work, the ODAs, they're 12-man teams. Some of them were out of control. I could give examples. There was one camp, there were Kurds, there was a military training team, there was an ODA team, 12-man special operations team, and then there were other government of Iraq were all on the same base. But the special forces group was just too closely tied to the Peshmerga. The Peshmerga, the Kurdish militias, were torturing people, and the ODA, the special forces guys, let it go, and the MIT team was like, do we turn these guys in or not turn these guys in? This was happening quite a bit, actually, in different areas. But I think, after Haditha and all this, the U.S. military got pretty concerned about it and made actions, and some people got prosecuted. But this is a problem, and it's something that the Abu Ghraib clearly was a black eye for the United States. But these are National Guards unit from Kentucky. You put, and I'm not making excuses here, but you want to occupy somebody else's government and take National Guard units from Kentucky and put them in a culture they have no idea about and put them in charge of a prison, things are going to go wrong. And a lot of Iraqis tell me, Iraqis are, they don't wallow in blaming Americans right now. They're like moving on. And a lot of them say, we don't really blame you, because if you took Iraqis and told them how to occupy Indonesia, we'd mess up too, right? And that's probably, it's a good comment. But we put, and we were talking about this before, we put young people without any cultural knowledge, and we put them in positions of authority, and something's going to go wrong.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question because you mentioned decapitation. One thing I was going to ask, because if we're not going to be using special forces, or we're not using Green Berets, are we going to be using certain other strike forces like 75th Rangers or more?
No, I think we'll use, there's the Delta, Navy SEALs.
Right.
They're more on the JSOC side. The difference that's explained basically usually between the Green Beret types and the JSOC guys is Superman and Daniel Boone. The JSOC guys are Superman. They come in, they have special, they come in, they kill the enemy, they do this. the Daniel Boone guys have to go and stay and train all the forces and learn the they're trained in the languages, they're trained in the cultures, and they go and stay a long time. And the difference is also who pulls the trigger in a battle. JSOC guys pull the trigger, the Green Berets teach our allies how to do the combat and pull the trigger. So, you know, I think, to get to your question, I think they're both going to be involved. But decapitation is not just hitting the leadership the way this is. This is debilitating the entire network going down. You're trying to take out the middle levels of a network. You need to get intelligence to be able to find those targets. And so we're going to get we need to get intelligence from our partners to be able to do this find, fix, finish. How are you going to find the targets? The question is, who's going to find the targets here if we do this in partnership? And I was talking with another professor looking at the Sahel in Africa. We have a lot of bases there. There's a lot of Al-Qaeda groups that are coming there that are connected. How are we going to deal with these Al-Qaeda groups? We want to take them out somehow. We want to do it at low cost. But I'm not sure exactly which are the military forces that are going to come in and have collect intelligence, and then we'll, you know, to do these types of drone strikes. But we do have special forces community. I think one of the questions, I don't know the answer to, I think it's developed, what's the future of our special forces communities? They did a lot of heavy lifting in Iraq. Is that the group we want to rely on that much now?
Thank you very much for a sweeping lecture, but as advertised, you turned a lot of very complex dynamics into intelligible conclusions, so thank you for that. I wanted to ask about a number of things, but I'm just going to focus on one because I've watched the cycle of state building is in, and then it's out, and then it's in, and it's out.
Yeah.
And you said point blank, clear hole build is not in the cards given where we are today. But state building is only out until it's back in.
Yeah.
And looking at Gaza and I would say Palestine writ large,
Yeah.
there is a need for state building capacity that the U.S. and allies can deploy. From your work, do you have any suggestions for what at least state building light capacity could look like so that we get out of this boom and bust cycle on state building?
You know, this is a really important question. I agree because, you know, as I mentioned, the Bush administration, when they came in 2000, was like, we're absolutely against nation building. All of a sudden, we're trying to recreate the whole Middle East, right? And I don't doubt if we get hit again in the homeland that we're going to say we need to reconstruct all these countries. The question, I think, is the combination of tools we have and how much of it, the playbook in the United States has been to rely on the military a lot. And even to rely on the military to do functions that are usually with the State Department. And you know, the military people I talk to is, they would have rather had the State Department do a lot of this. Because it's like, we're not trained for this. And I think part of this was the administration had some biases to work with the military during those years. So we need to get a division of labor between our partners, and one, so it's not just the United States looking like they're imperialists. And the division of labor internally within the State Department and the military, and get their roles more clearly, and NGOs. And we need a sort of an idea about how not to rely on just one source like we have in just one country. I think the ISIS war actually was done pretty well. The ISIS war, they got other Arab countries involved. They even got Sunnis involved, because this couldn't be a U.S. war, it couldn't be a Shia war. It couldn't. We kept the PMF, which formed, and the Shia groups. They actually did some of the fighting, but we kept them at arm's length in other ways. They weren't going to get intelligence or weapons. We found partners that were capable and were low-key, like the CTS, the Counterterrorism Service. We partnered with the Peshmerga, but then got them out of the way when it was politically dicey to get them involved, taking over an Arab city. And we used precision-guided munitions. One thing is, taking Mosul, the U.S. never used a 2,000-pound bomb. Israel has used 500, at least 2,000-pound bombs on Gaza to destroy stuff. This was a more balanced use. We only used 7,000 strikes in 2 months. The Israelis used 6,000 strikes in 6 days. This was a more calibrated use of force. So I think some of the things, the United States learned some lessons by the ISIS war. How to stay out of it, how to let partners take the lead, how to build a coalition. And actually, it's bad because Mosul and Raqqa don't look much different than Gaza at the end of the day. But still, there was more thought about the politics of it, how to involve partners, how to have a division of labor between intelligence, politicians, and state, and the military guys. And we didn't. Unfortunately, it's very hard to work with foreign militaries because we tried to build a military in Iraq. We spent billions and billions of dollars, and it fell apart. So this is why maybe using more supple forms of groups that you find maybe in special forces or different kind of units. But I think we have to have a good idea about what the problem is. And we had no really idea about the Shia. Most of we thought is going to be former regime elements and Sunnis were going to be the problem. And really it was the Shia that had the abilities. And it was the US intelligence should have thought that Sadr City, 1 million people there, they're already organized in a way, so was going to form militia. There's one chapter in the book in Ghazaliya, there was one neighborhood in the northwest of Baghdad that was all designated, all the neighbors in Iraq have a number. That neighborhood was all numbered for Iraqi military veterans. We should know that this is probably going to be a problem. So you got to know where the problem areas are. You got to use intelligence to do that. It has to be communicated. And I mean, this is a very complicated process, but certainly, you don't get involved with stuff unless you identify the enemy. And I think we need to think about our entire range of tools and how they combine. And I think there's a few things we learned that we can trust and what we can't trust. And we don't want to end up with the question here about having our National Guards people running prisons in another country. That's the kind of thing we just need to really avoid.
Okay, we told we have time for one more question.
So this actually kind of wraps things up well, I think. It sort of piggybacks a little bit off of the Dean's question as well. So you had mentioned that initially when we had left Iraq, it was peaceful. And, there were identity and cultural clarity issues that caused it to become not peaceful quickly. Do you think, and I think I could probably answer your question for you based on what you just said, but do you think that with partnership with the IC and state maybe in that aftermath time, so that in that initial time, do you think that would have changed things at all? As far as when we left, it was peaceful, like when we left militarily, it was peaceful, and then quickly afterwards. Like if there had been a buffer, a cushion time.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, but the problem, so one thing we did, here's the one thing which really could have made a little bit of a difference. When we did the Awakening in Sons of Iraq, we were flipping, the idea was to flip these people here. And we got guarantees from the Iraqi government that they would actually, the Sunnis that got flipped to the government side from insurgents, they would get security positions. They would be able to lead some of the police stations. They would get positions in the army. And this would have integrated Sunnis into the state after this. Well, Maliki was the president, gave some lip service. He did a few things before 2011. Immediately after 2011, these guys are out. And what was how do we get commitments? And this is the identity problem, right? Because Maliki was very concerned about Sunnis rising again and this kind of thing. How can we get our partners after we leave to carry out the commitments that they made? And this is a basic problem in political science, the commitment problem. And how do you do that if you don't have leverage and don't promise to use it? And, not to bring up Israel again, but, the United States has leverage, but we haven't used it very often. And when are we going to use leverage, and when is it going to be effective? And when is it not? But the case study that I had of the Ghazaliya case was somebody who was flipped over here, the guy I was smoking hookah with. Immediately after the left, he's arrested in Iraq, and then he got released after a year, and he was going to be killed probably. I found him in Amman, Jordan. There's a lot of people in Amman, Jordan that, they were supposed to actually be part of the government. And how did we couldn't force a better deal for them. And, but, some of these things just play themselves out, and I'm not sure that we're capable of doing it. But, one thing is just the hubris involved with some of this, and the understanding of the limits of military power. And this is something that we should be teaching and understanding better in our universities.
Thank you. So for people in my class, you can see why every class session ends in a depressed sort of way. Thank you very much, Roger.
Big little gift for you.
All right, great.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Professor Petersen, for being here and for a marvelous evening. We have a little token of our appreciation. Thank you very much for being here.